23 years later, President Putin has made Ukraine's preliminary steps to joining NATO the principal grounds for the Russian invasion of February 24, 2022. The alliance's leaders have always made clear that it is up to each European country to make its own decision about membership. But the eastward expansion of NATO particularly inflamed Putin, who has claimed that Secretary of State James Baker and other Western leaders assured Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990, at the time a unified Germany joined NATO, that the alliance would expand not 1 inch eastward. United Nations expert Alfred Desayas wrote in a recent article that John F. Kennedy warned in 1963 that while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Kennedy's warning echoes in large part Russian President Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, which most mainstream media failed to give much attention to. George Kennan would surely have understood Putin's reaction. The architect of the containment policy toward the Soviet Union wrote in 1997 that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Bells should have rung when Putin gave his Munich speech 10 years after Kennan's warning, in which Putin calmly expressed concern about the so-called flexible frontline American bases with up to 5,000 men in each. Desaya said that it turns out that NATO has put its frontline forces on the borders, and the public continue to strictly fulfill the treaty obligations and do not react to these actions at all. Against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Desayas also quoted the speech of the NATO General Secretary Mr. Manfred Wöhner in Brussels on 17th of May, 1990. The fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. Desayas continued by saying Putin's warnings and predictions were not taken seriously. This is perhaps because we have a distorted perception of reality, a kind of solipsism embedded in our self-centered worldview. Most people in the West remain unaware of Putin's speech, or for that matter, of the text of the two proposals that he put on the table in December 2021. Two draft treaties solidly anchored in the United Nations Charter concretizing the necessity of agreeing on a modus vivendi and building a security architecture for Europe and the world. However, the mainstream media bears considerable responsibility for failing to inform the public about Putin's speech and about his repeated offers to negotiate in good faith as required by Article 2 of the UN Charter. Quote-unquote, it is clear that NATO's expansion and the weaponization of Ukraine constituted an existential threat to Russia, and that the malevolent demonization of Russia and Putin since the early 2000s entailed a menace, a threat of the use of force, which is prohibited in Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter. I am Lovely Montoya of Manila STV.